Madam Chair, we're now live.
Thank you. Happy New Year, everybody. Thanks for coming back. If anybody's out there watching, Happy New Year. I just wanted to say, and forgive me for reading this, due to the COVID-19 emergency declaration, this meeting of Community Affairs and Planning Committee has been held electronically and live streamed on the town's website. All of the members of council and town staff in attendance are participating by audio and video conference. For the members of public watching from their home, please bear with us if we encounter any technical difficulties or speaking throughout this meeting. I'm going to call this meeting to order. Is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest? Okay, seeing that, I need a motion to adopt the minutes of December the 7th. Councillor Rob Tyler Moran and Councillor Khan, all in favor? Thank you. And we have, this is not a public meeting, so we have no questions. We have a presentation. I believe Mike Sawchuk is going to be doing a presentation for us on the background report for the town's initiating the zoning for driveways standard. Mike,
Yes.
the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. So I'm going to take a few moments tonight to discuss a town-initiated zoning bylaw amendment that relates to residential driveway standards. Just having an issue here. Advancing slides. Give me one moment, please. All right, I may need some assistance on this, Alec. All right, thank you very much. So as everybody's aware, parking demands in Ajax's residential neighborhoods have been on the rise for several years. And this has largely been in part to two things. One is increased vehicle ownership rates, and the other is trends to develop higher density residential communities. So when you combine these two things together, you have an increased supply of vehicles, but also a reduced supply of parking spaces. And this has forced residents to find alternative solutions for parking. Next slide, please. So one response that we've seen is street parking. And this isn't a viable long-term solution. It can result in all sorts of issues, everything from traffic issues to pedestrian safety to winter maintenance issues. Next slide, please. So what we've seen in other occasions is residents actually making unauthorized alterations to their properties and also to the town's boulevard lands. Next slide, please. So in response to this, in December 2018, Council directed staff to review the ability of residents to hardscape or modify town boulevards for the purposes of additional landscape design and/or additional parking. So this motion initiated a study that ultimately led to the boulevard encroachment policy. Now, it's important to note that the emphasis here from council has been focused on boulevard lands instead of private property. Next slide, please. So it's important for us to distinguish exactly what makes up the various elements of a residential driveway. So firstly, you have the driveway itself, which is a component that's located on private property. The apron is located on the town boulevard, and then the curb cut is actually the depression in the concrete curb that allows the vehicles to access the apron. Advance, please. So everything that was considered with the boulevard encroachment policy last fall actually related to the boulevard lands, which are those lands adjacent to the apron. Advance, please. What we're focusing on today is the driveway and the private property lands. So in order to make the same types of changes that were considered through the boulevard encroachment policy, we need to consider amendments to the zoning bylaw to make those changes on private property. Next slide, please. So with the final boulevard encroachment report, staff actually recommended to undertake a town-initiated zoning bylaw amendment. And this is because the issues related to parking can be better addressed on private property than they can be on the town's boulevard lands. So this presentation will focus on 8 different strategies that staff are looking at in order to tackle some of these driveway-related issues. Next slide, please. The first one is space dimensions. So anytime we're considering parking issues, the first thing to look at is actually the legal requirements for a parking space. As you're aware, if we create parking spaces that are too small, people won't be able to maneuver within them. If we create parking spaces that are too large, it's going to put a burden on property owners and actually just use too much space. So currently, the dimensions in our zoning bylaw require parking spaces to be 6 meters in length and 2.7 meters in width, which is larger than most municipalities. Next slide, please. What we are proposing is to reduce this slightly to 5.5 meters in length, which is a decrease of 50 centimeters, and to 2.6 meters in width, which is a decrease of 10 centimeters. So this would actually bring the town's requirements much more in line with what you see in other municipalities. And I think it's important to note as well that the vast majority of vehicles on the market today will fit within a parking space of this size. Next slide, please. So the next strategy we'll be looking at is uncoupling driveway and garage width requirements. So in the Town of Ajax zoning bylaw, we allow various properties to have different size driveway widths. And the way that we do this is essentially the zones with larger lots and therefore larger frontages are allowed to have wider driveways. However, within the zoning bylaw, there's also a provision that says that driveways cannot exceed the width of garages. So this causes some issues. And we believe, since it's the lot size, not the garage width, that should actually be dictating the driveway width. There's no reason to have this provision related to garage width. Next slide, please. So to demonstrate that visually, I wanted to use this example, which is from an R1A zone, which typically allows for 7.5 meter driveways, as you can see by the yellow arrow there. This particular property has frontage of around 40 meters. So a driveway of 7.5 meters is perfectly reasonable for the zone. However, in this case, the property owner is actually restricted to a driveway width of 5 meters because that's the width of their garage. So in our perspective, this is too tightly regulating things, and it's actually taking away from the intent of the bylaw. Next slide, please. The third strategy is to align driveway and parking space widths. So the maximum driveway width standards currently have no regard for parking space dimensions. So to provide an example of this, the R1E, R1F, and R2A zones all allow for driveways up to 5 meters wide. However, we need to consider that to fit 2 parking spaces side by side, you require 5.2 meters. So it would make sense to expand that driveway width from 5 meters to 5.2 because functionally it'll allow 2 spots side by side. Similarly, in the CR zone, which is the country residential, and the R1A zone, driveways are currently allowed to be up to 7.5 meters wide when it would only take 7.8 meters to accommodate 3 cars side by side. So similarly, we think that that should be expanded by 30 centimeters to accommodate that type of design. Next slide, please. And just to visually demonstrate this, so this is an example from R1E. The red arrow points to the current maximum driveway width. The green dashed line outlines the requirements for 2 parking spaces. As you can see, they can't be accommodated by the red line driveway. So we're saying that the sides of the driveway should be able to be expanded to 5.2 meters, thereby accommodating 2 spaces side by side. Next slide, please. The next strategy is to align curb cuts to driveway widths. So there are currently several zones within the zoning bylaw where the maximum driveway width is actually wider than the maximum curb cut. So in the R1D zone, you can have driveways that are 5.6 meters wide, but you can only have a 5-meter curb cut. In the R1F and R2A zones, you can have a 5-meter wide driveway, but only a 4-meter curb cut. So we obviously think it makes a lot more sense to align the maximum curb cut widths with maximum driveway widths in all zones. Next slide, please. And again, just to provide a visual demonstration of this, in the R1D zone, we quite frequently see scenarios like this, where the raised portion of the curb actually travels out over part of the travel portion of the apron. So we're constantly getting calls about things like this. And according to our zoning bylaw, they're not allowed to cut the curb in this way. So obviously aligning the curb cuts to the driveway widths is something that makes sense. Next slide, please. So the fifth strategy is to regulate the number of driveway accesses for each property. Currently in the zoning bylaw, there's nothing restricting the number of driveway accesses, and this causes several problems. We know that it causes people to disregard the width standards that exist in our zoning bylaw. It also in many cases results in a very high proportion of hard surfaces in front yards, and it can also reduce street parking, because everywhere that there's a new curb depression, you now can't have a car parked illegally on the street. So it is our intention to limit the number of accesses in all residential zones to 1, except for in the country residential zone, where we do think that 2 accesses are appropriate, as long as certain performance standards are met. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of a property where a circular or multi-access driveway may be inappropriate. As you can see in this case, the multiple access points actually require essentially the entire front yard to be hard landscaped. So in a scenario like this, it's likely not appropriate. Next slide, please. However, in the CR zone, where we have frontages that are at least 50 meters in length, or in width, sorry, it is much more appropriate for there to be multiple accesses because the properties are so much larger. Next slide, please. In these scenarios where the double accesses are permitted in the CR zone, however, we are looking to implement a couple of new standards. One is that the 2 access points be distanced at least 9 meters from one another. And secondly, that when you look at the 2 accesses together, so in this drawing, when you add A plus B, that does not exceed the maximum curb cut standard for the zone. Next slide, please. The next strategy is sticking with the CR zone, and really it's just to reconsider the way that we look at driveway widths in the CR zone. So these properties are drastically different than other residential properties in the town, and this is entirely because of their size, but it also relates to the fact that they don't have maximum garage width standards, and as we just discussed, in some cases it is appropriate for them to have multiple accesses. Because of these reasons, using a maximum driveway width standard is not a good fit for the CR zone. So what we're proposing to do is actually base driveway standards in the CR zone on area. Next slide, please. So the reason for this is the way that we measure driveways is that we're required to measure at the widest point parallel to the property line. Next slide, please. So when you actually do that in the CR zone, you can see that essentially none of the properties conform to the standard. But I think most people would agree that these driveway designs are appropriate for the area. So really what we're looking to do here is correct for something that's existed for a long time and find a better way to actually regulate how driveways are designed in this area. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the way that we could do this is by looking at area. So how much of any yard does that driveway occupy? What we're proposing is that driveways and or parking areas shall not occupy more than 30% of the area of any front yard. Next slide, please. Or if that driveway extends into the side yard or rear yard. When looking at these cumulatively, driveways and or parking areas shall not occupy more than 10% of the aggregate area of the rear and side yards of any lot. Next slide, please. So the next strategy we wanted to tackle was that relating to hard landscaping. So currently we don't have any setbacks in our zoning bylaw for driveways as they relate to side property lines. This can cause issues for a number of reasons. One is encroachment onto neighboring properties. The second is elimination of snow storage. And the third is interference with drainage swales and water infiltration, which are generally designed as part of any neighborhood design. So our solution here is to introduce a new permeable surface buffer, which would require 0.6 meter setbacks from any interior side lot lines. And the main asset to this is it will help preserve the swales and areas for stormwater infiltration. Next slide, please. So what we're really looking to avoid here is scenarios like this, which is a photo from Montreal, where you have front yards being entirely hardscaped. And the result of this is stormwater obviously being forced out onto the road into the municipal systems. So creating this hard landscaping or driveway side setback will prevent this type of scenario. Next slide, please. So just to provide this visually for you, if you look at the right-hand side of this diagram, you'll see that, as I mentioned, this 0.6 meter setback would not relate only to driveways, but to any hard landscaping that's occurring in the front yard. On the other side, we see that that's been reduced to 0.3 meters. And the reason for that is because in this case, and in many of our residential zones, one side of the property, the house is built to within 0.3 meters. So it wouldn't make sense to force a driveway to be 0.6 meters away when the house is only 0.3 meters. So in those specific scenarios, the setback gets reduced. Next slide, please. So the last strategy, and probably the most meaningful one, is for us to better delineate walkways from driveways. So as I mentioned before, we have very strict sort of regulations in our zoning bylaw about how we are to measure maximum driveway width. And when we are taking that measurement, the direction from the zoning bylaw is to include all contiguous hard surfaces. So any surface that's adjacent to a driveway, as long as it's the same height, it counts within the measure of driveway width. So this results in a state of non-compliance for many existing driveways, including most of those that do have adjacent walkways. It's our perspective as staff that property owners should be able to construct walkways and also beautify their properties without having to apply for a minor variance. So we think it's our job to find a balance between what should and what shouldn't be permitted. Next slide, please. I think most, if not all of us, would agree that something like this is a reasonable alteration to a property. So in this case, you have small sidewalks or walkways located alongside the driveway, which technically would extend beyond what is permitted in the zoning bylaw currently. But in this case, those changes are quite minor, and I would say they are appropriate. They do help to increase the curb appeal of a property like this. Next slide, please. Whereas something like this may be not so desirable. In a case like this, almost the entire yard is covered by hard landscaping. And in certain scenarios, you could have 7 or 8 different vehicles parked outside of the front of this house, which isn't something that sort of helps to keep our communities beautified. Next slide, please. So the approach we've taken is really to emulate the standards that were recently approved by council for the simple boulevard encroachments. And what this is allowing a 1.8 meter extension along the side of the driveway nearest the main entrance and a 0.6 meter extension on the opposite side. So one of the keys here is that these new walkways that are being added must be visually delineated from the driveway through a change in material, color, or layout or pattern. And there are a few additional standards that I'll get into through the diagrams that we also have to add in order to maximize the functionality of these sidewalks. Next slide, please. So in the most sort of basic demonstration of this, you can see the 1.8 meter sidewalk, which would be permitted on the side of the driveway that approaches the entrance to the house. And then you would have the 0.6 meter walkway on the other side. Next slide, please. In reality, however, we know we can't just have these walkways stopping at 1.8 meters. There are logical connection points that are going to lead to stairways, to porches, even around back to the sides of these houses. So we think it's appropriate that when we're within 1.5 meters of any obstructions, so that could be a part of the building, it could be a set of stairs, any sort of raised element at all, the 1.8 meter does not get calculated in that area. Next slide, please. So to provide a sort of visual demonstration of this, in this example where you see the horizontal arrow, obviously the walkway extends beyond 1.8 meters there, but it is appropriate because it is within 1.5 meters of that raised garden bed. And we know that no vehicles would be able to sort of access that area. Next slide, please. A similar example here where the owner has extended the hardscaping essentially across the front of the property. But in this case, it is appropriate because, again, they're within 1.5 meters of that raised step. So we can't have a scenario here where vehicles would cross it and use that as a parking area. Next slide, please. So what we're really trying to avoid with this 1.5 meter standard is scenarios like this, where vehicles can actually traverse away from the designated parking area and park on parts of the hardscaping that are clearly intended as a landscape feature, not for parking. Next slide, please. So the best way to do this is through a combination of that 1.5 meter standard from obstacles that I already mentioned, but to allow property owners a little more flexibility in having other areas of hardscaping in their front yards. They can also use what we're calling a restriction point. So that does exactly, it prevents exactly what was shown in the last slide, because there are no vehicles essentially on the market that are less than 1.5 meters wide. So this will prevent any vehicle from traversing from the parking portion of the driveway over to another area of hardscaping. Next slide, please. With the photos I had, I did not find a great example of this type of scenario, but this one's fairly close. You can see that there is quite a bit of hardscaping in the front yard here, but it is appropriate because it's not being used for parking. And the reason it can't be is because there's a very small restriction point of less than 1.5 meters here that would prevent a vehicle from traveling over to where you see the chairs. Next slide, please. So next, the visual delineation that we're requiring can really be accommodated in a number of ways. Next slide, please. The first and most common is by a change in material. So this is what we're generally seeing when people are already adding to their driveways. What they're doing if they have an asphalt driveway is typically they're using material like stamped concrete or pavers, for example, to create new walkways. So what this does for us is if we receive a call to bylaw complaining about a property, we know exactly what to measure as part of the driveway and then what is considered part of the walkways alongside. Next slide, please. In cases where the driveways and walkways are constructed from one material, rather than changing material, what you can do is use a different color material. So this is a case where the property owner has used more of a charcoal colored stone or paver to differentiate from the rest of the driveway. So again, if there were any calls about this or we needed to determine whether it was within the standards of the zoning bylaw, very easy for bylaw to go out, measure what is the driveway, and then measure the component that we know to be an associated walkway. Excuse me. Next slide, please. The last example here is a little more nuanced, and it's a little tough to see with this photo. But where it's all one material of essentially one color, the other option is to delineate the driveway from the walkway by means of a change in the pattern. So here it's a soldier course, which is somewhat difficult to see. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but there's a soldier course running alongside, pretty much level with the edge of the garage. That differentiates the driveway over from the walkway. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, the aforementioned strategies will facilitate numerous town objectives, such as alleviating on-street parking issues, providing more flexibility to property owners, and creating a comprehensive set of driveway-related standards that align with other municipal documents and reflect best practices. So today, staff are seeking authority to begin public consultation in early February, with expectations to report back to CAP in April 2021. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Sawchuk. Appreciate that detailed presentation. I have a speakers list. Regional Councilor Sterling Lee.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Sawchuk, for the presentation. My concern right now is reducing it's for, I think it was from 6 to 5.5 in length. And right now, if I use my own driveway as an example, which is a pretty fair example, that is barely enough to put one SUV and one mid-size car into the driveway. And it's just, if we reduce that by 0.5, then I just see more violations happening as a result of that. I guess these are comments, not so much questions. And I guess, it's very, the beginning of your presentation, you acknowledge that planning's acknowledged an increase in vehicle ownership rates. And I hope that's reflected, not just in this document, but in future planning discussions, because a lot of times when there's like a new development, for example, we find out that we've been reduced from 2 to 1.25 or to 0.75 parking spaces or visitor parking spaces or whatever that number may be. And it's always counterintuitive because we're trying to encourage people to use transit. That is absolutely the goal. But what ends up happening is that that's not the case, and we end up creating problems for ourselves. So just general comments in general of just, I hope that we stick to a lane, so to speak, in terms to whether we have enough parking or we don't have enough parking, whether we're encouraging transit or not encouraging transit. Because during your open house, I don't want to see this mixed messaging of, yes, new driveways going forward is going to follow these dimensions because we want more people to park there. But then we end up like reducing it for a developer because we say they'll end up taking transit because it's by a transit hub. So at this point, I think it's more prudent for council and for the town to just kind of commit to whether it's transit really the focus or is more parking. And if you were to ask me, I think the answer is more parking. So I'm glad this presentation came through. It makes a lot of sense. It'll really help the aesthetic of the town, and especially in certain developments where people have not obeyed the rules, and it goes hand in hand with the encroachment bylaw we just passed. So thanks for the presentation. Those are my notes, and thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Rob Tyler Morin, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There's a lot of detail, a lot of work went into this, and I appreciate it. I know it's your job, but this is particularly deep presentation. My concerns are, again, more comments than questions, is that this stems from, we have a problem with parking in Ajax. We have a problem with parking in Nottingham, all throughout Westney Heights, etc. So then we think we have to do something about this because there's literally more parking than there is driveways. So now we said, okay, let's allow people to expand their properties so we can put it on. The thing that I'm concerned about is that people might abuse that. Something, again, that we can maybe look forward to, bylaw looking forward, that they don't start putting in illegal basement apartments because they'll think, hey, now I can have income property. That's one thing that I've been asked to look at from residents. The other one is the scape itself, because to me, it's better to have a bit of an extra wide driveway than have parking on the street. But with all that said, what I'm really sort of concerned about is that there's a lot of information here, and I believe there's 30,000 driveways in Ajax, if I'm right, about 1,000 streets-ish. So I want to make sure that either through communications or bylaw, that people can access this information clearly. They can get a clear answer, you know, like a simple questionnaire, because I think if they look at the spaghetti, they're just going to go, you know what, forget it. And they might end up trying to do it themselves. It'll be hard for us to police. So I just want to make sure that it's user friendly. That's something I think that, you know, I'm a little ahead of myself because we haven't concluded this yet. But whatever happens, I want to make sure it's really clear, it's easy. I got my driveway installed. Yeah, I know I made one phone call or one email and they explained it to me. It was good. I want to have that kind of responses back from our residents. Thank you so much.
Councillor Khan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Sawchuk. So again, a comment, you know, Councillor Lee and I, we've always been encouraging our residents to empty your garage and clear your garage out to use for parking. And I wish communications can also do something to help encourage our residents to use their garages. If we can address that, this will solve a lot of our problems. So for a comment. Now, a quick question, Mr. Sawchuk. How do you know the border between the property line between like on the screen right now, that driveway that has no sidewalk through it, like mine currently as well? How do you know what the border is for the property line? That's the town's boulevard and the residents' part driveway.
So through the chair, that's a good question. And that's something that we have to help a lot of residents with. Typically, anyone who purchases a property will get a copy of the property survey, which will include a measurement from the front of the house to the front property line. So that's usually how we direct them. However, I know it's quite common for people not to have a copy of their survey. So in those cases, if they call the town, generally a planner or some member of staff can look online and come up with a relatively close measurement by using our online GIS system. So when we do provide a measurement to them using that system, we're always, you know, careful to ensure that this is not an exact number, but your property line is, you know, approximately 5 meters from the curb or whatever that number may be. Now, the interesting thing is when you look at the solutions that we're proposing through the zoning bylaw, they match very closely to what council's already approved for the boulevard encroachment policy. So all of a sudden, properties like this one that's featured on the screen that don't have a sidewalk, it doesn't matter so much as it once did in terms of what is that line that delineates the private property from the public property, because now you can essentially do the same thing on both.
Okay. So for me to know what my border is, I have to call the town pretty much. That's if I don't have my survey sheet.
If you don't have your survey, you can call the town, and there are also services available to get a copy of to purchase a copy of your survey.
Okay, thank you. And
if I may, Councillor Khan, it's Jeff Romanowski here. Another kind of general rule of thumb, and you might be able to even see it in this photo behind the vehicle on the left-hand side. But you know where sometimes on everyone's property you have a water shutoff valve,
yeah,
right? And that's usually in the driveway or just in your lawn beside your driveway.
Yeah.
Typically that valve is located about 30 centimeters on your property. So the property line might be within 30 centimeters of that closer to the street. That's another kind of guiding element or landmark on the property that might help a resident get a better idea of where exactly that property line is.
That actually helps a lot. Thank you, Ms. Romanowski. That's great. And you want to report back in April. When do you guys hope to implement this?
So through the chair, we hope to go out to the public in February and be able to do a consultation that actually includes both the zoning bylaw amendments that are being proposed and provides updates on the boulevard encroachment strategy that's already been approved, because we haven't yet really had the opportunity to publicize the boulevard encroachments, because these two tools or these two strategies really do work hand in hand. So we expect to go out to public in February, and then by the time we receive feedback and we're able to make any revisions that may be necessary and come back to council, it would be April.
Okay.
And the intention behind that as well is to have all of this wrapped up for the onset of construction season. So in late April, early May, that's when we generally start getting the calls about people wanting to widen their driveways.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Mr. Sachak. And again, if we can get that message out to residents, help encourage them to empty their garages and use that, it will save a lot. Anyways, thank you very much, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Mayor Collier? You're on mute.
I said I wasn't going to do that today. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Sawchuck. I wonder, can you go back a couple of slides, or sorry, yeah, back a couple of slides. Okay, stop there. That's good. No, over. I just wonder, well, either one is good. What happens if this is approved today and this house, for instance, didn't have a modified soldier course? If they just continued the same pattern, if this is passed when this comes back in, say, April, as is this resident going to be required to tear that up and make changes?
So through the chair, I think there would be two options available there. One, which, in the grand scheme of things might be the easier option, is yes, to do as you said, maybe, cut a line through the driveway, replace it with, a different set of stones, or reorient the stones somehow. The other option is to apply for a minor variance. So that is something that can be considered for a wider driveway. However, keep in mind that if a property owner does choose to go the minor variance route, we can only consider a minor variance on the land that they own. So if it's all between a sidewalk, let's say, and the house, well, then that is an opportunity that we can consider for the minor variance. If it also relates to the apron portion of the driveway, that can't be considered through a minor variance.
Okay, let's go to the slide before this one.
Sure.
So, sorry to interrupt you. From what you're saying, so if this person hadn't done that different color,
Yep.
it wouldn't conform. What would this person, because this person doesn't have a sidewalk and it goes all the way to the curb, what would this person have to do to remedy that if this is passed as it's presented today?
The best option, as I stated previously, would be to actually undertake the repairs that are required to make that delineation. Now, I think it's also important to recognize that without knowing the exact zone that this house is in, there is a chance that this entire driveway, so spanning from both sides, incorporating even what's on the outside of that border, there is a chance that it all fits within the driveway width standard for that zone. So for example, if this was an R1A zone, that permits 7.5 meters. And I've looked at a lot of driveways at this point, so I can say, fairly certainly that this would be less than 7.5 meters.
Yeah, I would safely assume this is not an R1A or a CR. So
Yep.
It's allowed 5 meters. I can see it's probably fits the 1.8 on the right-hand side, but the other is probably over 0.6. So what would this resident have to do with the 0.6 side?
So there's a couple things that I think would have to happen here. In this particular example, we also have the new standard relating to the hardscaping and driveway buffer from the side lot lines. So you can see in this instance here, they've actually hardscaped entirely between the two houses.
Right.
So that would have to be removed, likely on both properties, and replaced with either, it could be soft landscaping, something like a flower bed. It could also be something like crushed stone, which allows water infiltration. So this is where the fact that we're calling it a permeable buffer comes into play. Because we know in some cases people are going to want some kind of a system that doesn't require maintenance like grass would or like gardens would. So as long as it allows for water infiltration to happen, we're able to consider it. So crushed gravel in there or some kind of decorative stone would be fine. But they would have to make some sort of modifications to their property.
Okay, so they are going to have to tear up what looks like very expensive and nicely done pavers and make some changes in this case.
Yes.
Madam Chair, perhaps it's Stev Andis, if I can also offer some clarification to Mayor Collier's question. The zoning bylaw amendments are a go forward tool. So someone who has modified their driveway prior to the zoning bylaw amendment coming into force would only have to comply if there was a complaint about that particular property, and bylaw would then go and see if they comply to the current parking, or if they didn't comply to the provisions that were in place at the time they did that, then they would have to comply. But
Okay,
this is not something proactively that people now have to go and change.
that's helpful. I believe we have, I think it was it 150 or 250 outstanding sort of stayed bylaw complaints right now? 250? So, I mean, if this is one of those 250, they're going to have to go and tear this up and make that change. Put a permeable strip down the middle. I can see very clearly this is, even if there wasn't a complaint, I could see very clearly that this is wider than their driveway, so it wouldn't comply anyway. Currently, I guess where I'm getting at with this is the whole process of this exercise was to try and find a solution so people wouldn't have to go back and make changes to existing. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely do not want to see cars parked on, for instance, that little what would be considered the walkway there, even though it's too wide. But it is delineated by a different color stone. But that doesn't mean somebody can't park there. So what I really want to make sure we're doing is bringing forward something that solves the problem we have, but isn't going to create new problems as well. So I see a couple of new problems potentially coming out of some of these changes. I think it's a good improvement, but I don't know if it gets us where we need to be. Like just going to Mr. Sawchuk, to the delineation between driveways and walkways that you talked about, and having a change in color or material. I don't see having a change in color or material, in this case, a change of color, is going to stop anybody parking on there.
Right. So through the chair, that's an important consideration that we really had to strategize on for this, because as you said, we were really trying to find a balance here. What we want to be able to do is accommodate more parking, but we don't want to create scenarios, as you said, where you just have, cars everywhere on a property. So by creating this system whereby you have the addition to the driveway being a walkway, that is not technically a parking space. So I believe another comment was made earlier where it was along the lines of, well, if people can provide a walkway, excuse me, alongside their driveway, well, now maybe they're going to be able to have an accessory apartment because of that. That's not the case, because this is a walkway. This isn't a parking space. Now we have the discretion, or council has the discretion, sorry, to provide input on how the bylaw team goes out and enforces these things. So by creating this visual delineation, we know what's driveway and what's legal parking. We know what's walkway. But if council directs bylaw not to ticket cars that are parked on the walkway, well, now we have a sort of solution in one sense, because it's not a legal parking space, but it can functionally accommodate a car when that necessity arises. So this is quite a different solution, I think, than you see in other municipalities. But it's something that we started to implement through the boulevard encroachment strategy, where we have these same sort of policies with the visual delineation. And now we've just expanded it to the private property side of things.
I hear you, but we all know that in reality, in some cases, people are going to push the envelope. And I can tell you numerous stories of people swearing up and down they've had a complaint of parking. Bylaw's gone to enforce. You go there, they go, no, it's just a walkway. It's just a walkway. I don't park there. And, you know, bylaw shows me 10 pictures of cars parked there 4 wide. Or I go back the next day and there's definitely cars parked there. I mean, we just don't have the staff to be able to do that and enforce that or monitor that. Again, I understand we can make that change, but then that makes that change everywhere and it's just not enforceable. Going back a few more slides, there's one where, and you don't have to go back, but there's one where the walkway runs the entire width. Or sorry, the entire length of the driveway. And I'm wondering, because this is again, maybe that house, what are we doing in cases where somebody has an accessibility issue and needs to have the wider space to get an accessibility, whether a scooter or wheelchair or something, along the full length of the driveway? That would not conform because now that's going on to the town portion on the boulevard as well.
So through the chair, so it would actually conform. And the reason it would conform is because the boulevard encroachment policy allows for the exact same thing. As a simple encroachment, it allows for a 1.8 meter extension on the entrance side of the driveway, and it allows for 0.6 on the opposite. So it replicates the exact same standards, which thereby allow for somebody to create something like this running the full extent of their driveway. So that was part of the intention of sticking with the numbers we did.
Okay. And as far as to the country residential zoning that you had at the beginning of the presentation, I represented North Ajax for quite some time. I don't think I've ever received a parking complaint for Deer Creek, for instance, or any of the other CR properties up there. Are there any of these changes that you talked about that are going to cause any of the homes up in that area to have to modify their existing driveways?
So through the chair, I think first off, it's important to reiterate the point that was made by Ms. Andis, and that is that we've been enforcing these situations based on complaints. So if a complaint is not received, then we're not proactive in going out and enforcing these sort of things. I agree with you that the number of parking complaints is much less obviously in the CR zone, because I don't think there's a lot of issues with people's cars hanging out over the street or parking in the boulevard, that sort of thing. So what this is really intended to do in the CR zone is bring the existing properties into compliance, because we have had situations where somebody's looking to make, let's say somebody's looking to renovate their property, or they're looking to add an accessory unit, and they want to start counting the number of legal parking spaces. We look at the driveway, and the driveway is 20 meters wide in some places. It looks reasonable because it fits that style of property, but technically they're not in compliance with the zoning bylaw, because you're only allowed to have a 7.5 meter wide driveway. So the point we're really trying to make here is to sort of redesign the zoning bylaw so what's already in existence is actually legal, because right now none of it is.
Okay. And thank you for making that clarification, because like I said before, the last thing I want to do is fix one problem and create another. So hopefully this will solve those 250 outstanding and let them come into conformity for most of them, and make things easier going forward. Those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Sawchuk. Thank you, Madam Chair.
That's the end of my speakers list. Does anybody else have any questions? I just wanted to just say that when I was a local councillor, I think it was last term, there was a complaint on one of the streets that I looked after, resulting in 7 driveways being affected, along with the actual person that started the complaint. So it was a mess. That I never want to live through that again, ever. I hate those complaint-based ones. I did want to ask one question though, around one of the pictures that you showed. It was like they had kind of paved over the entire front yard, but we were okay with it because it would be hard for them to actually park there. They couldn't park a car there. What happens then with drainage and flooding and all that stuff with neighbors? Because I've had equal complaints about people who are doing yard work that that causes all kinds of flooding in their backyard, their front yard. Are we really okay with people just kind of paving over their front yard, even though just because they can't park on it?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that was actually the intent of us creating this permeable buffer setback. In some cases, some of these yards are quite small, and we are okay with most of those being hardscaped. And actually, right now in our zoning bylaw, there's nothing to prevent somebody from hardscaping their entire front yard as long as it's raised to a different level than the driveway. So this permeable buffer setback, the intention is to create at least one area on all properties where you can have drainage and you can have water infiltration. And this will be a big improvement to what we have right now. So oftentimes we get applications, or in the past we've gotten applications for people wanting to expand their driveway right to the property line. And we have our engineering team saying that's not advisable because this property has been designed with a swale running right down that property line. But there's nothing we can actually do to prevent it because there's no requirement in the zoning bylaw. So this one new addition with these permeable buffers will ensure that there is an area for drainage on both sides of every property.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
If there's no other questions, I'm going to need we have a recommendation. If I can find it here. Do you need me to
Move
read
to
it?
receive for information, Chair.
Yes, that's all it is. And then to proceed with the public virtual open house.
That too.
That too. You're going to move that, Regional Councillor Lee, and seconded by Councillor Bauer. If there's no other further questions, all in favor?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Sawchuk, for your presentation.
Thank you.
And I think I need a motion to adjourn. Look at that. Mayor Collier, Councillor Tyler Moran. All in favor? Thank you. Have a good